"Dad, that filthy kid is eating our garbage. But she has Mom's bracelet." The words came out of 9-year-old Joey's mouth so quietly that Martin Aldridge almost didn't hear them over the sound of the November wind cutting through the back alley behind Aldridge and Sons Lumber, the company his grandfather had built from nothing in Barrie, Ontario, and that Martin had turned into one of the most successful building supply operations in the province. He had been carrying a box of old invoices to the recycling bin when he froze. He turned slowly. At the far end of the alley, crouched beside the dumpster, with her knees pulled to her chest, and a half-eaten granola bar in her hand, was a girl. She couldn't have been older than 11. Her dark hair was matted and damp from the sleet. Her jacket, if you could call it that, was a man's flannel shirt 2 sizes too large, the buttons mismatched and one sleeve torn at the elbow. Her boots had no laces. She hadn't noticed them yet. She was eating with the focused, deliberate stillness of someone who had learned not to draw attention to herself while doing it. And around her left wrist, catching the thin gray light of that November afternoon, was a gold bracelet with a small blue enamel maple leaf charm. Martin's legs stopped working. He had bought that bracelet at a tiny jewelry shop on Dunlop Street 11 years ago. He had fastened it around his wife Claire's wrist on the morning their daughter was born. Claire had worn it every single day for the following 8 months, until the night she disappeared from Barrie General Hospital, and the police closed the case 14 months later, concluding that Claire Aldridge had walked out of her own life. Martin had never believed that. Not for a single day. But he had also, somewhere in the 4 years since, stopped letting himself hope. He looked at Joey standing beside him. His son's small face tight with something he couldn't name, not confusion, not fear, but something older and more careful, the expression of a child who has watched his father grieve quietly for so long that he has learned to handle possible pain with both hands. "Stay here," Martin said. He walked toward the girl. She heard his footsteps and scrambled to her feet instantly, backing against the chain-link fence, the granola bar gone somewhere inside her jacket. She was ready to run. He could see it in the way her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, the way her eyes moved to the gap between the dumpster and the building wall. "Hey," Martin said, stopping 10 feet away. He crouched down to her level, the way you would with a dog you didn't want to frighten. "I'm not going to hurt you. I wanted to say hello." She stared at him with dark eyes that were far too watchful for her age. "What's your name?" he asked. She said nothing. "That's okay. You don't have to tell me." He nodded gently at her wrist. "That's a beautiful bracelet. Where did you get it?" Her hand closed over it immediately, instinctively pressing it against her chest. "It's mine," she said. Her voice was low and slightly hoarse, like someone who didn't use it much. "I know," Martin said. "I'm not trying to take it, He stopped. His throat had done something complicated. "Can I ask, do you know what the little charm is on the bracelet?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she opened her hand and looked down at it. "A leaf," she said. "A maple leaf," he said. "Very Canadian." He tried to smile and wasn't sure he succeeded. "I'm Martin. What do people call you?" Another long silence. "Birdie," she finally said. "People call me Birdie." Behind him, he heard Joey's sneakers on the wet asphalt as his son ignored the instruction to stay put and came to stand a few feet back, watching with those same careful eyes. "Birdie," Martin repeated. "Are you hungry, Birdie? We have a kitchen inside. It's warm." She looked at the back door of the building, then back at him. Every line of her body said she had been in situations where adults invited her somewhere warm and it had not ended well. "Just food," Martin said quietly. "And then you can go wherever you want. I promise." Joey spoke up from behind him unexpectedly. "We have soup. My grandma made it. She puts too much dill in it, but it's still pretty good." Something shifted in Birdie's face. Not a smile. Not quite. But the smallest reduction of the terrible wariness that lived there. She followed them inside. Martin Aldridge had not always been a man who carried his grief like a stone in his chest. There was a version of him before Claire that people remembered as easygoing, quick to laugh, the kind of man who stopped to talk to strangers and remembered their names the following year. His mother Elaine still kept a photograph on her mantle of Martin at 28, laughing at some forgotten joke, his whole face open to the world. He was 44 now. He ran a good company, raised a good son, showed up for the people who needed him. But the openness had closed, the way a window closes against a storm and stays closed even after the storm passes, because the latch has rusted in the meantime. Claire had been everything light in his life, and her disappearance had been, in the truest and most terrible sense, inexplicable. They had been happy. He was certain of that. Not in the way of a man rewriting memory to comfort himself, but in the way of someone who had examined the evidence carefully and arrived at an honest conclusion. They were happy. Claire was happy. She had wanted the baby, had spent the last months of the pregnancy painting a nursery in the house on Maple Avenue and reading aloud to her stomach from a worn copy of Anne of Green Gables that had belonged to her own mother. And then, 8 months after their daughter was born, a daughter they had named Willa, after Claire's grandmother. Claire had gone to the hospital for what should have been a routine follow-up appointment. She had left Willa with the sitter. She had kissed Martin at the door and told him she'd be home by 4. She was not home by 4. By 6, Martin had called the hospital. Claire Aldridge had arrived for her appointment. The receptionist confirmed. She had been seen by her doctor, and then she had simply ceased to exist in any record that the police could trace. The sitter had gone home. The baby had been there when Martin arrived, sleeping in her crib, her small hand curled under her cheek. For the next 8 months, Martin searched. He hired investigators, drove himself to the edge of something he was afraid to look at directly, and held Willa with the desperate tenderness of a man who understood that she was the last piece of something irreplaceable. And then Willa too was gone. A Tuesday morning in April, 5 years ago, Martin had put Willa down for her nap and gone to answer the door, a courier with documents, and when he'd come back upstairs, the crib was empty. The window was open. The maple leaf bracelet, which he had placed on the dresser after fastening it to Willa's tiny wrist for a photograph the week before, was gone. The police had investigated and found nothing. His father-in-law, a man named Douglas Hale, who had never fully accepted Martin as a suitable husband for his daughter, and who had become increasingly erratic in the years following Claire's disappearance, was interviewed and cleared. There were no leads. Martin had been left with Joey, his son from a brief earlier relationship, a boy he loved fiercely and completely, and the ruins of whatever he had imagined his life would be. He had kept the company running. He had raised Joey well. He had over years assembled something that looked, from the outside, like a life. But he had never taken the crib down from the upstairs room, and he had never, not once, stopped watching the face of every small dark-haired girl he passed, looking for something he would recognize without being able to describe it. Birdie ate the soup. She ate it the way she ate the granola bar, with focused, deliberate concentration. But as the warmth hit her and she realized no one was going to take it away, she slowed down slightly, and Martin watched the tension in her shoulders drop by increments he could almost measure. His mother Elaine had arrived within 20 minutes of Martin's text. She was 71, sharp as a winter morning, and had the gift of making children feel immediately, irrationally safe. She sat across from Birdie and asked no questions, simply provided more bread and asked whether Birdie preferred the dill, or if she'd rather have the other soup, which had no dill at all and frankly more flavor. "This one's okay," Birdie said. "High praise," Elaine said, without smiling but with something warm in her eyes. Joey sat beside his grandmother and worked on his homework with the focused performance of a child who is absolutely not eavesdropping. Martin sat at the far end of the table and watched Birdie and tried to understand what he was feeling. The bracelet was unmistakable. He had stared at it long enough to know it was not a coincidence or a resemblance. It was the same piece, the same small manufacturing irregularity in the maple leaf charm that he had noticed when he bought it, the left edge of the leaf slightly thicker than the right. He had mentioned it to the jeweler at the time as a small flaw. She had offered to replace it. He had kept it anyway. But a bracelet was not a person. He waited until Birdie had finished eating. Then he said quietly, "Birdie, do you know how old you are?" She looked at him. 11. The math hit him like cold water. Willa would be 11. "Do you know when your birthday is?" Something flickered across her face, not suspicion exactly, but a careful recalibration. "Why? I'm just curious," he said. "You don't have to answer." A pause. "February," she said finally. "Somebody told me February." Willa had been born February 14th. A Valentine's baby, Claire had laughed, on the way to the hospital. She had been embarrassed by how much she liked that. Martin breathed carefully. "Where do you live, Birdie? Is there someone looking after you?" She looked at the table. "I live with some people, on Dunlop." What kind of people? Her silence was its own answer. Martin looked at his mother. Elaine looked back at him with an expression he had seen once before, 12 years ago, when he'd told her he was going to ask Claire to marry him. Not approval exactly, more like, I see what you're doing, and I want you to be right about it. The next morning, Martin drove to the address on Dunlop that Bertie had eventually, reluctantly, given him. It was a rooming house that the city had been trying to close for 3 years, the kind of place that accumulated people the way a drain accumulates debris. The man who answered the door, a broad, unfocused person who smelled of cigarettes and something worse, confirmed, with irritating casualness, that there was a kid staying there, had been for about 2 years, came with a woman who'd left her. He didn't know the woman's name. He didn't know the kid's name either, he said. He called her the quiet one. Martin drove directly from there to his lawyer's office. He also called his friend Russ Tamblyn, who had spent 20 years as a detective with the Barrie Police Service before retiring to do private work. Russ was the same investigator Martin had hired 5 years ago, and the two of them had arrived, over the course of that investigation, at a kind of careful friendship built on shared frustration and mutual respect. I need you to find out about a man named Douglas Hale, Martin told him. I know you looked at him before. I need you to look again, harder, and I need you to find a woman. I don't have a name, but she was living in a Dunlop Street rooming house approximately 2 years ago, and she left a child there. Russ was quiet for a moment. Martin, what happened? I found a kid, Martin said. He stopped, tried again. I found a kid who has the bracelet, Claire's bracelet. He heard Russ set something down. I'll start today, Russ said. Bertie came back the second afternoon. Martin had half expected she would, and he'd half expected she wouldn't. And when he saw her standing at the back door of the building, with her hands in the pockets of the too large flannel shirt, something in his chest did something he had stopped letting it do. He opened the door. Soup's from a can today, he said. My mother doesn't come on Thursdays. Okay, Bertie said and came in. They ate together at the kitchen table, Martin and Joey and Bertie, and Joey talked about a project he was working on at school. Something about the water cycle which he found, he explained seriously, genuinely interesting, unlike most things they made you study, which were mostly just things adults had decided children should care about. Bertie listened. She didn't talk much, but she listened in a way that was complete and engaged, her eyes moving between Joey and the soup. And once, just once, she almost smiled at something Joey said about his teacher's unfortunate relationship with the word precipitation. Martin watched her. There were things he was afraid to look at directly. The shape of her jaw, the way her eyes moved, which was a way he had seen in exactly one other person and had spent years trying to remember precisely. The dark hair and the particular way she had of going very still when she didn't trust a situation, which was a thing Claire had done too, a stillness that looked like calm but wasn't. He was afraid of hoping and being wrong. He was more afraid of not hoping and being right. He asked her, that second afternoon, if she had anything, any documents, any papers, anything someone had ever told her about herself. She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into the inside pocket of the flannel shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn thin at the creases. She unfolded it with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable, and she passed it across the table. It was a birth registration. Partial. The mother's name had been torn away deliberately, the tear too clean to be accidental. The father's name was blank, but the child's name was there, Willa Ann Aldridge, and the birth date, February 14th. Martin sat very still for a long time. When he finally looked up, Bertie, Willa, was watching him with those dark, careful eyes, and he understood that she had carried this piece of paper for a long time and had never shown it to anyone, because she had learned, the way children learn things that adults do not know they are teaching, that showing people the things that mattered to you made you vulnerable in ways you could not always survive. How long have you had this? He asked. His voice did something at the end that he couldn't control. Always, she said. The lady, the one who left me, she gave it to me before she went. She said to keep it. She said someday someone would ask. Martin had to put the paper down. He put it down and pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed. Joey had gone very quiet. When Martin looked at him, his son's face held an expression Martin had no name for. Not quite grief, not quite joy, something in between that was perhaps the feeling of understanding. For the first time, The full size of a story you have been living inside without knowing it. Birdie, Martin said, and then stopped, because that wasn't right, wasn't the name he needed to say. Willa. She flinched slightly when he said it, as if the name were too bright, too fragile to be spoken aloud after years of living in the dark. I think, Martin said carefully, that I've been looking for you for a very long time. Russ found the woman 2 weeks later. Her name was Sandra Bright, and she was in a women's shelter in Aurelia, 60 kilometers north, working through something that had broken her badly enough that she had needed 3 years to find her way back to herself. She had been, Russ reported with the careful precision of a man who had long since learned to deliver hard information gently, a former employee of the rooming house. Before that, she had worked as a care worker at a private psychiatric facility south of the city. The facility was called Lakeview Restorative, and it had been operated until its sudden closure 18 months ago by a company called Hale Family Holdings. Martin read that line twice. He called Russ. How long has it been operating? He asked. Opened about 9 years ago, Russ said. But here's the thing. I pulled the incorporation records. The company that holds the property goes back 12 years, and the registered director, until 2 years before it opened, was Douglas Hale. He transferred the directorship to a numbered company before the facility started taking patients. Martin sat down. He hid his involvement, Martin said. Deliberately and carefully, Russ said. Martin, I found a patient file. It took some doing, and I'm going to pretend I don't know exactly how I found it, but it exists, and the patient's name is Claire Aldridge. The room did something strange. Martin was aware of the sound of the furnace running, of Joey's voice upstairs talking to a friend on the phone, of the photograph of Claire on the bookshelf that he had kept there every single day for 11 years because he had refused to let it mean she was gone. Is she? He started. She was transferred to a different facility 18 months ago when Lakeview closed, Russ said. A legitimate one, this time. She's in Sudbury. She's been receiving actual care. Martin, from what I've been able to piece together, she's been there long enough that she's been improving. Martin closed his eyes. He thought of Douglas Hale, who had called him inadequate and restless, and a man who didn't understand what family meant, who had, throughout Claire's pregnancy, inserted himself into decisions with a controlling intensity that Martin had attributed to grief over Claire's mother's death the previous year, who had arrived at the hospital the morning after Willa was born with a new lawyer in tow and paperwork that Martin had signed without reading, assuming it was something routine about the birth. He thought of a man who could look at his own daughter's happiness and see, instead, a threat to something he valued more. I'm going to Sudbury, Martin said. The drive north took just under 3 hours. Russ came with him, and Martin was grateful for that, for the particular company of someone who understood what was at stake without needing it explained, and who knew how to be quiet in a way that was useful rather than empty. The facility in Sudbury was nothing like what Martin had imagined Lakeview to have been. It was a low building in the trees north of the city, clean and quietly institutional, with staff who knew their patients by name and a woman at the front desk who, when Martin explained who he was and who he was looking for, made a phone call before he had finished his sentence. They put him in a small sitting room and told him to wait. He waited for 23 minutes. He counted. And then the door opened. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair, which had been long when they married, was cut short now, practical and neat. She moved carefully, the way someone moves when they have spent a long time relearning how to trust their own body. But her eyes were Claire's eyes, dark and direct, and even now, after everything, even now looking at him from across a room they had never shared, in a life that had been taken from both of them, even now, there was something in her face that opened when she saw him. Martin, she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, or from something harder than disuse. He stood up. He was across the room in 3 steps. He didn't have words for a long time. Neither did she. They stood in the middle of a room in Sudbury in November and let 11 years of the wrong kind of silence finally, carefully, end. Later, much later, after the doctors had spoken and the lawyers had been called, and Russ had spent 2 days building a case that he would eventually hand to the Ontario Provincial Police, along with documentation that would result in Douglas Hale being charged with unlawful confinement, fraud, and the criminal interference with a family member. Later, Martin told Claire about Birdie. He used both names. He said Birdie first, because that was the name she had made herself, the name she had chosen to survive on, and it deserved to be spoken. And then he said Willa, because that was the name Claire had given her, and she deserved to hear it said by someone who had always meant it. Claire put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes went very bright. "She has the bracelet?" she asked. "She never let it go," Martin said. The first meeting was in the living room of the house on Maple Avenue. On a Sunday afternoon in December, when the light came through the windows, the way it does in the Canadian winter, low and golden and sideways, making everything look slightly miraculous. Willa sat on the edge of the couch. She had been living with Martin and Joey for 3 weeks by that point, in the room that had always technically been hers, newly painted now, with curtains she had chosen herself and a bookshelf that was almost empty and waiting. She was wearing a sweater Joey had lent her because she refused to go shopping until she had been in the house long enough to be sure it wasn't temporary. Martin had stopped trying to convince her otherwise. He understood the logic. He had learned to be patient with the logic. When Claire walked into the room, Willa stood up. Just stood there in the borrowed sweater, the bracelet on her wrist, watching this woman she had never known and had carried, all the same, somewhere in the wordless knowledge of her body, the way children carry things before they have language for them. Claire stopped just inside the doorway. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, the dark hair, the careful eyes, the specific stillness, and then she said, very softly, "I know this is strange. I know you don't know me." Willa said nothing. "But I knew you," Claire said. "I knew you for 8 months before anyone took anything away. And I never—" Her voice broke cleanly. She held it together by the thinnest margin. "I never stopped looking for you, even when I couldn't look, even when I didn't know what year it was. Even then you were in everything." The room was very quiet. Willa took one step forward, then another. She moved the way she always moved, with that watchful, deliberate care of someone who had learned to carry themselves through a world that had not been kind. But she moved toward Claire, and when she reached her, she stood close enough that Claire could put a hand, very gently, on her daughter's shoulder. Willa let her. Joey was in the kitchen doorway, watching all of this with the expression that had no name, the one that lived somewhere between grief and joy and understanding. He caught Martin's eye, and Martin smiled at him, the kind of smile that did not require either of them to say anything. Elaine, in the armchair by the window, was not pretending to read her magazine any longer. She was watching her son's family reassemble itself in the winter light of the living room, and she allowed herself, quietly, the feeling she had been holding back for 11 years. That love, which is not reasonable and does not obey the rules of loss, sometimes finds its way back, not because the world is fair, but because there are people in it who refuse, stubbornly, daily, at great cost, to stop holding a place open for the ones they love. It is not the whole story, of course. There are court dates ahead, and testimony, and the long, slow work of Douglas Hale being held to account for the years he stole. There are therapists and difficult conversations, and mornings when the distance between where they are and where they should have been feels very large. But in that room, in that particular light, with Joey watching from the doorway, and Elaine letting herself cry quietly by the window, and Martin standing in the middle of everything he had refused to stop believing in. Willa looked up at Claire, and for the first time since she was an infant in arms she could not remember, she was held by someone who had always, at every moment, intended to hold her. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun. It came down the way it does in Barrie, steadily, without drama, covering everything in the patient and familiar way of things that have been there all along, waiting to be seen.